Pressure, right? Well, if y'all can't tell, I'm back in the saddle this morning for one last go around. This has been an awesome summer. Just being 1 year removed from the youth group has presented itself with some awesome advantages, but there were some disadvantages along the way. Every now and then I have to tell them, I can't mess around with y'all anymore. I gotta, put my foot down to some things. But it's been an awesome summer. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm so thankful for this church, for the opportunity to come up here and develop myself and hopefully develop this youth group in a more spiritual way that's pleasing. But I'm preaching today, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword because I missed 3 weeks for a vacation in Colorado. So Jacob is kind of like, yeah, you got to make up for that, and so here I am this morning. But I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to share with y'all what I want to offer this morning, and that is what we call a good life. This supposed life that once we've done everything that we're supposed to do on this earth, that's what we say. We say we've lived a good life, that everything we've done, everything that we've created, established, success, it's supported by this phrase. This phrase, it's a declaration of accomplishment, to be able to say, I lived a good life. But when I look at this phrase, I have to ask, are we really that shallow? Are we ready and willing to say that everyday things in life, things that are man-made, that have an end, that those things are responsible for us having a good life? We fill our lives with things. We fill our calendars with events. But at the end, does that matter? If living a good life is based on the idea that the best thing you will ever be able to do is retire and enjoy vacation home, then yes, that is a good life. But is there more? Is there more than a stereotypical good life? And I believe so. But don't hear me wrong. I'm not dogging those who want to work hard, who have ambition and desires. I have my own goals and dreams that I'm working towards right now. But I am saying we need to be cautious of when our dedication to those special events, those dedication to our goals, take over. So if there is more than life than declaration of accomplishment, if there is more than building the perfect resume, if there is more than being able to say I lived a good life, then what is it? What is the true definition of a good life? And I want to answer those questions this morning through the story of Job. I want to tell his story through the lens of what we call a good life. Just to make sure that everyone is on the same page here, I'm going to give a brief outline of Job is. First of all, the book of Job is actually an interesting story. It's considered that the author was Moses, like, let my people go, Moses. So I think that's pretty cool that it has this lineage. But some scholars believe that the actual character Job was among those who returned from the Babylonian exile in 538 BCE, which, of those of you who are not Babylonian historians, that was about 7 centuries after Moses' supposed death. So it'd be kind of hard to Moses to write something if he was dead. So we aren't exactly sure who wrote the book of Job, but we do know a lot about Job himself. We know that he lived in the land of Uz, which was in the area of Edom. And here's a map to give a perspective view on where that was. So somewhere in this circular region is where Job lived. Uz was in the area of Edom, and somewhere in there was this man called Job. But we also know that he was highly respected. He was a highly respected religious man in his culture. In the beginning of Job chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil." This praise continues at the end of verse 3 by boldly stating, he was the greatest man among the East. And I just want to sit on that for a moment, because to be blameless, to be upright, to fear God and shun evil, already those 4 things kind of sound like a good life. Those 4 qualities of a man sound pretty promising to me. If you were to describe someone with those, you would already think in your mind, that's a pretty good life. So the praise keeps going. He was the greatest man among all the people. What type of title is that? to be recognized by the greatest man in all of the East. That's quite an accomplishment to be able to say. But it also continues, chapter 1, verse 2 through 3. It says, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. Wealth is a huge part of Job's story so far. All of these characteristics, these qualities, it just frames the boundaries of a good life. Continuing with what we know about Job, we read on to learn that he was a caring father. He loved his children and wanted the best for them. In verse 4 through 5, it says, his sons used to hold feasts. In their homes, on their birthdays, they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. From this clip of scripture, we can see how much Job cared and how much of a good man he really was. Not only did he celebrate his children and provide them with food and drink, but he went the extra mile and made sacrifices on their behalf just in case they did something they shouldn't have. And right at the end of verse 5, I love this part. It says it was Job's regular custom. I think that's really interesting. Job isn't a one-time only kind of guy. This was a regular routine of love, a repeating pattern that shows a caring parent. In my mind, it's one thing to have wealth, to have respect, but if you don't know how to use those things, then it's really meaningless. And Job is a steward of the gifts that God has given him. He knew how to use his wealth, he knew how to love his family, and he knew how to treat his respect. So already, this man has a good life. We know he's a man after God's own heart. We know he was a wealthy man, and he was a caring father. But Job's story doesn't end here, and I think for this particular reason, there's something to be said for that. Because how many of us would like Job's story to end at this moment? Everything's happy. Nothing that I've said has been sour. It's not displeasing. It's very satisfying to know that this man has a good, happy life. So if we continue, though, on through chapter 1, we come across dialogue between God and Satan. In verse 6, the conversation ends at verse 12. However, I'm going to pick up the story this morning in verse 8, which reads, Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless, upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Now, we have heard something similar to this earlier in the chapter, but something even more powerful than this verse itself is who speaks it, because this is dialogue between Satan and God. When I quoted this scripture earlier, a man, the author of Job, had quoted God, but this is God's words. For God to say these characteristics about a man, how powerful is that? For God to say that his servant, that there's no one like him, that he is blameless and upright, that just goes to show that God knows who Job is. And that plays an important part in Job's story. It plays an important role to know that Job was an important man to God. But if we continue reading, we find that Satan doesn't like what God had just told him. From verses 9 through 11, it says, Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, Have you not put a hedge around him and his household, everything he has? You have not blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And I have to put this into perspective for me. When I'm reading this, I take it a lot more aggressively than as it's said in Scripture. Because if you're about to get in a fight with someone, and you're ready to go, you're about to smoke them in the face, and they just kind of look at you and push you off. Like no word, no punch, no fist, no power you ever have will hurt me. How's that going to make you feel? Are you going to back off like, okay, that's impressive, I'm not going to hurt you? No, you're going to be mad. You're going to want to really get that guy. So for God to tell Satan, no, nothing you will ever do because he's blameless and he's upright and I know my servant, Satan is not going to like that. So when this conversation goes down, I think Satan's about to turn into a cartoon. He is red, steam is pumping out of his ears. Does Job fear you for nothing? Have you not put up walls around him? Have you not safeguarded his life from my wolves? Why, he would not praise you and worship you. You have blessed his work and spread his livestock around this earth. But if you want to see what this man is really made of, take it away. Burn down those walls, and surely he will cast insults against you. And right after Satan says this, he's still steamy mad, spits on the ground, and starts storming out of God's room. And calmly, God just whispers back to him in verse 12, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. For the longest time, I was confused with this particular passage of Scripture, and I still am, because what this verse is essentially saying is that God gives control, all the power to Satan to harm someone. And how does that work? How does a good and just God give power to evil? How does he let evil run a man's life? And I wish I had an answer for you. This is one of the biggest questions that could ever be asked, and I by no means have an answer for it. And although we could argue God never let Job get hurt, Satan never had the actual power to physically hurt Job, so it could have been worse. However, if you read on in chapter 2, which we will get to in a moment, we find God removes all the limits. Satan is given all the power to harm Job in every way except death. So to say that Job had it easy, that there were any easy days, that's foolish. Job gets it bad, and he gets it really bad. But there's a thing about Job. There's a critical piece of information, a critical piece of his character that sets Job apart from everyone. He knows something that we have forgotten. We read the next chunk of Job's story starting in verse 13. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they're dead. I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." This just hurts to hear, doesn't it? If you're living and breathing in this room this morning, you have either been through a storm or you're about to go through a storm. Life is full of challenges and storms, and for Job, it's no different. Everything that we just called him for, everything we just noticed about this man's life, the wealth, the respect, his religious principles, everything that we have just talked about has been ripped away from him in these verses. But again, there's something about Job. What did God say about him before all of this? God had said there is no one on earth like him. He had said he is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. That's why in verse 20, to all of this pain and suffering, Job responds. Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground and worshiped. How hard is that for us? When our darkest hour is amongst us, how hard is it to say, "Praise be to God"? How hard is it for us to know that God is the true king? Job knew that. See, it's pretty easy for us, and myself included, to be thankful on the good days. But on the bad days, how often and how quickly do we turn away from God? How hard would that be to endure the suffering, and your first instinct is to fall on the ground and worship? And listen to what Job prayed. Job said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Everything that has ever been given to him is now gone. How could he possibly have a good life with nothing? To put Job's story in perspective, I'll tell it like this. How many of you love graphs, like using the path of life, right? So if we were to use this in our lives, this would be pretty ordinary. You start at 0, so your birth. And then you go to the top, which our goal as Christians is heaven. And so this would be our path of life. And every single dot that's on there may look small, but every single dot is very powerful and important. And if you think, well, I'm not sure that every event in my life has an impact on me, I beg to differ. How many times in your day do you get distracted? Does your attitude change? Every event that happens in your life can change tomorrow. And there's no different story, no different situation for Job, because every single event that has just occurred could have changed his values, his morals, and his beliefs. But we find out that that doesn't happen. And if this was a Disney movie, then Job's life is about to get back on track. But if we go to the next graph, it looks like this, right? This is kind of Job's life right now. It starts off good, but then that happens. And mathematicians out there, I don't even know what that is, but there you go. How often do our lives look like that? They just are crazy filled with everything, distractions, plans, and how often does it end up like that on the ground? And again, if this was a Disney movie, then Job's life is about to get back on track. There's about to be a great song written, and it's going to turn and go back up. However, life is not a series of unfortunate events that can be turned around by perseverance, but a test of faith and the willingness to accept what God offers us. Because chapter 2 opens a whole new can of problems for Job. In the beginning of chapter 2, it opens with a similar conversation between Satan and God. In verse 3, it starts with, "Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity. Though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason.' 'Skin for skin,' Satan replies. 'A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life.'" Now all the limits have been removed. Job's body is no longer immune from the touch of Satan. How would that make you feel? In movies, there's a common quote of someone being threatened to be beaten within an inch of their life. Like, how is that even measurable, to be beaten within an inch of your life? Well, if we were to ask Job, I reckon he could tell us. Because Satan now has power over his body. Satan now has power over the diseases that are inflicted by him. His health is gone now. He is literally taken to his knees in suffering. In verse 7, it says, "Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head." And it continues in verse 12, when his friends come to comfort him, it says, when they saw him from afar, they could hardly recognize him. Satan had sickened Job so much that he was disfigured from his friends. He was unrecognizable by those closest to him. When you were a child, you knew from the back of your hand the way your parents looked. You could spot your parents in a crowd of 1,000,000 people. You were so accustomed to seeing the back of their head and the tops of their shoulders that you knew who they were. You could spot them out anywhere. And so when you saw the front of them, of course, you knew who your parents were. Your friends, you can recognize your friends from a mile away. Well, Job's friends, they couldn't recognize him. He was so sick, he was so plagued with disease that they didn't even know who he was. So how is that a good life? How is nothing a good life? This man with this God, how could he have a good life? How could a man with disease and loss have a good life? The best answer I could give, that I think anyone should ever give, is actually from Job. In verse 10, he responds to his wife, who is actually doubting his beliefs, doubting his integrity. He responds to everything that has ever happened in his life, the pain, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He responds with this: shall we accept good from God and not trouble? That's my main point this morning. To sit back